For a closer look at how the president's affinity for Putin does or does not shape his administration's policy, I'm joined by Natasha Bertrand, staff writer for The Atlantic, covering national security in the Mueller probe, and MSNBC national security analyst Ned Price, former spokesperson and senior director at the National Security Council under President Obama. And Ned, let me start with you because you did serve in the NSC. Again, there are, my understanding, and I want you to sort of correct me if I'm wrong here. My understanding is that there are informal, very brief pull-asides that will happen at these big meetings, but they tend to be staffed and they're not particularly substantive. This doesn't sound like that. What do you make of it?
It doesn't sound like that at all, Chris. Pull-asides, at least in the traditional sense, are quite literally a pull-aside. You might pass a leader in the hallway and say, hey, let's have a quick tactical chat about something. And typically, when you chat with a friendly counterpart, the French president, the British Prime Minister, you may not have an aide accompany you, but when you chat with someone like the Russian president, an adversarial relationship, you will typically have a note taker and a translator, your own translator, not relying on the Russian translator, for instance. There was something really interesting about this article that wasn't mentioned, and that's the sourcing. If you read the sourcing in the Financial Times article, it comes from the Russians, and that leads me to believe this may be the work of the Russians themselves, trickling this out, almost trolling President Trump, reminding him again and again that, hey, we have stuff we can hold over your head. Let's work together, and how about you find a way to make our policy wishes come true, or we can make your life much more difficult.
And this has happened before, Natasha. The meeting by Sergei Kislyak and Lavrov that happened the day after the firing of Comey, when the president infamously told them, I've got rid of all the pressure. We learned about that from the Russian news service, not from the president of the United States. They do seem to have more information about these meetings than are being publicly disclosed by our own president.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, by my count, it's been at least half a dozen times since Trump took office that we've learned about his interactions with Russian officials from the Russians before we've learned it from the Trump administration. And I think Ned's point about this particular story being sourced to the Russians is a really important one, because just remember that the Trump administration right now is taking a position on Venezuela that the Russians really don't like. And so if they wanted to make the Trump administration look really bad at this particular moment in time, then doing this and raising more questions about whether or not Trump is compromised, and like Ned said, reminding him that they have leverage, is a really strategic move by them. But I think that the question about what they spoke about during this meeting, the 15 or 20 minutes that they were sitting at this table, just Melania, Trump, Putin, and a translator, is interesting because it also came right as the news was breaking that Michael Cohen had told, had admitted essentially to lying about the Trump Tower Moscow deal. The White House canceled the meeting that Trump was going to have with Putin formally at the G20 right when this came out. So the question now is, of course, did Putin and Trump have any discussions about Trump Tower Moscow? Did they discuss Syria? Because, of course, Trump announced the withdrawal from Syria not 3 weeks after that meeting. Were there any discussions about Venezuela? And the answer is that we don't know, because there were no aides or translators present.
And that point Natasha makes, Ned, is an important one about the administration's Venezuela policy. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, which has been very aggressive, really seeking to oust Maduro, who is backed by the Russians, which they do not like. So there's a sort of conflict there. There's also conflict in Syria, where the president announced that very abrupt withdrawal, and now it seems to be walked back. That's on the other side of the ledger in terms of where the president is with respect to the Russians, and you wonder how that plays out if, in fact, they are able to leak things they know about him.
Well, that's right. You're right on both of these counts, Chris, but I think we have to look at this more comprehensively. This isn't really Trump's foreign policy. This is John Bolton's foreign policy. This is Mike Pompeo's foreign policy when it comes to Syria and Russia. Take Syria, for example. And last month, in December, I should say, when President Trump said we're getting out of Syria, he said we're leaving Syria and we're leaving now. Never did he say in 4 months. Never did he say anything about an enduring presence in the remote outpost of Al-Tanf. That is something that John Bolton and Mike Pompeo set forward subsequently. When it comes to Venezuela and this rumor of 5,000 troops, I tend to believe that is the work of John Bolton, that he actually intended for cameras to catch that. You look at the video and the way he moved his paper around. This is not a media neophyte. This was a Fox News contributor, someone who knows how to work a camera, and someone who knows how to make a message. And I think that's what he was doing yesterday.
Natasha, there was the news of Attorney General Whitaker yesterday saying, sort of stumblingly and hesitatingly, but for time on the record, the Mueller probe is wrapping up. He is going to be before Congress, as I just noted, on February 8th. What do you make of that pronouncement, which was not particularly sure-footed, but was the first from a public official on that?
It didn't come across as an announcement, right? I mean, it was in response to a question that a reporter asked, and so in that way it seemed kind of off the cuff. But he did say that he was briefed on the investigation, and, you know, former FBI officials and Justice Department officials that I've spoken to say, look, this is something that they would have discussed prior to this press conference and say, look, this is probably going to come up. This is how you have to answer it. But it is weird, though, that he gave a definitive answer, and it just seems like he was trying to kind of nudge Mueller along while also trying to pressure by trying to, you know, appease Donald Trump and say, look, this investigation is going to wrap up soon. Don't make any rash decisions.
Yeah, he didn't look particularly comfortable there. Natasha Bertrand and Ned Price, great to have you both. Still to come, Roger Stone making an appearance in court today, seemingly unfazed by his charges for Mueller, but there's news that Mueller might not be done with Stone. That story in 2 minutes.